Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi and I'm the chair of the committee. This is the first evidence session of our inquiry into the draft Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill. Pre-legislative scrutiny of draft bill is an important aspect of select committee work, and we are covering the effects of leasehold for people up and down the country. It is important that the government gets this legislation right. So we're grateful for the government for publishing a draft bill and enabling pre-leg scrutiny to take place. Over the next few weeks, our select committee will be holding evidence sessions considering written reports, evidence from stakeholders and public about their concerns of the draft bill. Once we've completed the evidence sessions, this committee will publish a report on our conclusions and recommendations on the draft bill. The government is not required to accept our recommendations, but they are required to provide a formal response within 2 months, which will also be published. At some point after, the government will then formally introduce a bill in Parliament with or without any changes, and that bill will go through the usual legislative process. So we're grateful for everyone who's taken the time to engage with our inquiry so far and all the written responses we've received. To date, we have received over 5,000 responses from homeowners, from online surveys. All of that will help us in terms of determining our final inquiry and report. For anybody watching today's session, we will share all our views on the proposed reform and the link on the committee website. The survey for your responses and evidence is opened until the end of March. Finally, on a procedural point, there is at least one ongoing legal case regarding the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024. Ordinarily, the House of Commons and its committees will not normally discuss matters live before courts. This is known as the sub judice resolution, and it is designed to respect the jurisdiction of the court in such matters. We've asked for permission from Mr. Speaker, and on this occasion he has waived sub judice resolution in order to allow Parliament to fulfil its constitutional role. Following the discussions between myself and Mr. Speaker, this committee is exercising a waiver to the sub judice to enable us to undertake pre-leg scrutiny. That means that this committee and its witnesses appearing before us can discuss any legal case if they are relevant. Any evidence given to this committee, whether orally or in writing, will in any case be protected by parliamentary privilege in such a way. Can I ask my committee colleagues to introduce themselves, please?
I'm Gag Mahindra, I'm the Conservative Member of Parliament for South West Hertfordshire.
Lewis Cocking, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Broxbourne, and I am a leaseholder as well.
Chris Curtis, I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Milton Keynes North.
Will Forster, the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Woking.
Morning, Andrew Lewin, Labour MP for Welwyn Hatfield.
Sarah Smith, the MP in Hyndburn and also a leaseholder.
Sean Woodcock, Labour MP for Banbury.
Andrew Cooper, Labour MP for Mid Cheshire, and I declare an interest that I served on Cheshire West and Chester Council with Katie Kendrick, who's one of the founders of the National Leasehold Campaign.
And I'm Maya Ellis, I'm the MP for Ribble Valley.
Now it's our guests to introduce themselves, please.
Good morning, my name's Catherine Williams. I'm one of the co-founders of the National Leasehold Campaign.
Liam Spender, I'm a trustee of the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership. I'm a leaseholder and I'm also a solicitor.
Thank you. We finally have a bill we can scrutinise. I know many of you have been waiting for a very long time and we are making some progress on this. We've got a range of questions to ask this morning and for different panels, so we are going to be very tight and I will be very firm in chairing and cutting people. Over to Gagan.
Thank you. Can we start with ground rents? The government says that this draft bill will bring the feudal leasehold system to an end. What impact would this legislation have on ordinary leaseholders? And can I start with Catherine?
Thank you. I think the first thing to say is that if this bill comes to fruition and Commonhold is the tenure of choice for flats, then it will save a lot of people from actually being leaseholders, which is a good thing. For those who are currently leaseholders, it does set out a framework for them to convert to Commonhold, which is something that our campaign has been campaigning for 9 years, which is good. We do have some concerns really about the non-conforming leaseholders in a block and how that will be managed, because obviously it appears that their leases will have a deed of variation for them to remain as leaseholders in a Commonhold block. We're concerned about the cost of that, because if they couldn't afford to enfranchise to be part of the Commonhold Association, then how are they going to afford to have their leases, or will they be actually charged to have their leases changed to be able to be part of that block? And the other group of leaseholders that are not really dealt with in the bill are leaseholders in houses, because obviously on these large estates there's going to be a mixture of flats and leasehold houses. So you could end up with a situation where the Commonhold Association manages their block and has control over managing agents and fees and all of that, and yet the residents in leasehold houses will still be under the control of managing agents for the wider estates. So I think that's something that really needs to be looked at, especially the boundaries of the boundaries of the Commonhold Association. Just where does their control begin and end on a larger estate? Just as an example, recently on our group, one of our leaseholders contacted us because she'd been in conversation with her freeholder about this bill and about the cap of £250 on the ground rents, and her freeholder seems to be under the impression that it will only apply to the actual unit that she lives in, and the car park, which is separate, it's not part of that building, will still have some sort of lease and ground rent attached to it. So I think there's a lot to make very, very clear about where the boundaries are.
Liam, same question, if I may.
Yes, I mean, for new buildings, it's a long overdue reform that puts control where it belongs, which is with the people paying the bills, and it brings England and Wales into line with the rest of the world, so that's very welcome. But for existing leaseholders, whilst there are some measures in the bill, like reform of forfeiture, there's not a lot, because we're waiting for the 2024 Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act to be commenced, and progress with that has been somewhat frustrating. I think there is frustration that there's a 40-year sunset period for existing ground rents, albeit that they're being reduced to £250 without any inflation protection, but it's still money people have to find to pay for nothing. And perhaps a major shortfall in the legislation is it's only existing leaseholders who have the right to buy their freehold who will be able to convert to Commonhold, and that's not every leasehold block. So the bill is welcome. It's a big step forward, but I think there's more to do.
Yeah. Liam, you mentioned the 40-year proposal. Do you think that's a fair balance between freeholders and leaseholders?
Personally, I would prefer a shorter period. It's I don't know why 40 years has been alighted on. Scotland, for example, did it in 30 years. I would have thought 20 years was a fairer period, but I can see the government does need to strike a balance between the different interests of leaseholders and freeholders, but if the period could be shortened, I think it should be.
Catherine, do you have any views on that?
I certainly do. The initial response from our members on the £250 cap was quite positive, but we realised that they were mainly London-centric leaseholders who have much higher ground rents than elsewhere in the country. But looking at it, it seems that the results of the ground rent consultation, which was we had back in, I think it was 2023, has actually been reported in one of your documents. If I can tell you, it's the Addressing Unregulated and Unaffordable Ground Rent Policy. It came out in January 2026, page 6. And the outcome of that ground rent consultation is in here, and it states The consultation responses demonstrate that leaseholders overwhelmingly supported a rapid move to a peppercorn cap. And it goes on to say, obviously, that the freehold investors didn't like any of the 5 options, not surprisingly. From the point of our campaign and our members, they still are finding it very difficult to justify handing over their hard-earned money to a faceless freehold investor who may have offshore accounts for nothing. And I think we need to make it really clear that ground rent is for nothing. It's going to be a 42-year sunset clause on it. You may as well call it a 42-year leasehold perpetuation clause, or for some of our members it will be a till death do us part clause. I would be 112 in 42
What would you
years.
say to the government, because they've raised concern that we would have their explanation not to pursue the immediate ground rent, where they've cited concerns around the transition to a new system immediately would implement significant risk and market disruption with adverse impact on freeholders and investors?
Okay. They must be not very good at business then, because all the freehold investors, it's just perspective, isn't it? It's a gamble. When they bought up the ground rents, it gave them an extremely high return rate of, I believe, between 6 and 8%, but investments go down as well as up. And they've had benefits of those investments for a number of years now, a long time, whereas leaseholders are not getting the benefit of those ground rents. They're just paying them. So, to be honest, I think our members really, they're not concerned about the freehold investors at all, because they're running a business, and they should have put things in place before now. They knew it was on the cards. They should have done it.
Liam, I think you've been on record as saying you're concerned that there's a gaping loophole that ground rents may be included in head leases and service charge. Do you still share that concern? And do you think that government should have concentrated a bit more on the service charge element as well as ground rents?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of valuable reforms in the 2024 Act that have still not been commenced, which would go a long way to dealing with many of the issues we see in service charges, and they should be brought forward as quickly as possible. But my view is, for as long as it's possible to create leasehold flats, it's possible to put head leases above them with things that are described as service charges, which look like ground rents, which are very common in modern, complicated mixed-use sites where you've got retail, shared ownership, housing. There's very often an estate service charge that's not linked to the cost of providing services, but is linked to RPI. And that looks a lot like a ground rent. They're buried into the head leases. The leaseholders have to pay them through service charges. The longer you allow leasehold flats to be created, the greater the risk is of more of those sorts of estate service charges being created. So I think we should move quickly to stop it.
Just move on to the Law Commission recommendations. The government previously said that this draft bill would enact the remaining Law Commission recommendation on enfranchisement and the right to manage, but it does not. What difference would enacting those changes make for leaseholders?
It would make it much easier for leaseholders to take over buildings. For example, one of the Law Commission recommendations was about sites like mine, where you have multiple blocks, but the leaseholders can't simply step into the shoes of the existing freeholder. They have to go block by block and get the requisite 50% plus one majority in each block, which makes it more difficult and drawn out to take over the site. And if the Law Commission recommendations were enacted, it would make that process easier. The other thing the Law Commission recommended was changes to the enfranchisement process, restriction on the ability of freeholders to seek development value, which would reduce the price paid. Again, that's all bogged down with the problems we're having with the 2024 Act, which I know it must be the third or fourth time I've mentioned it, but it is a major problem.
Catherine, any views on that?
Yeah, just to add one thing, one of the omissions from the Law Commission was a publication they wrote, which was Management of Housing Estates Framework 2025, which actually gives a very good framework of how, this is the point I made earlier, about the wider estates being able to take control back and manage their estates. That includes houses as well as the flats. So I don't know why that wasn't implemented or thought about. I know there's something in there about having greater control over managing agents for housing estates, which is welcome. That's really, really good. But why can't house owners have the same benefits as the common holders are going to have in the flats? And that's a strategy that could help, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Naya.
So I just want to ask a bit about managing agents, because obviously regardless of whether it's Commonhold or Leasehold, we're still going to have to manage with managing agents, and we've had some discussions as a committee already about the fact that obviously there isn't much mention of managing agents in this bill. So just as an initial question, to what extent do you think the success of Commonhold will rely on effective regulation of property managing agents?
It's absolutely crucial that managing agents are controlled and regulated, but it has to be an independent body with some teeth that can impose meaningful penalties when things are not done. And without that, it doesn't matter if it's Commonhold or Leasehold. I think that applies to anybody on any tenure if they've got a managing agent.
I think Commonhold will succeed because it will give the most important power of hiring and firing to the people who pay the bills, and that's the most effective form of regulation there is. If managing agents aren't up to the job, they'll be replaced with someone who is. I don't think we should divert too much energy from improving this bill into regulating managing agents at the moment, because there's a risk that what will happen in existing leasehold flats is it will push up prices, because the cost of that regulation will be passed on through service charges. And I'm not convinced until everybody living in a block of flats or a managing estate has the power to hire and fire that you will actually see any improvement in quality among managing agents.
I'm interested, do you envisage the market of managing agents to change? Do you think there will be new types of companies who will open up, or do you think it will be the same agents as now, just managed by different people?
I think in the future the agencies that will thrive are the ones who are resident centred and understand that Commonhold puts the people who living in buildings in democratic control. So it would be very disappointing if the likes of the current large managing agents, First Ports and Amy will be familiar with, if they were still in business when there are a large number of Commonhold properties, because they don't see the residents as being at the centre of what they do, and I think they're dinosaurs looking at the asteroid heading towards them. I would hope so anyway.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that one point I have to make is managing agents should never be self-regulated. They've proven to be very bad at that, and they have to somehow be regulated to give a better service. We're hearing that managing agents and other people in the sector, solicitors and so on, are getting training on Commonhold. What we're not seeing is the residents, the people that are going to be managing the blocks in the Commonhold Association being offered any form of training or support to take it forward. So that's another kind of threat to the Commonhold system.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah, and then I've got two other members. If you can be very tight in your questions, please. Sarah.
Just to push a little bit further, if there's evidence you can draw upon either in other systems in other countries that actually suggests that democratic power of the common holders would have the effect of improving the deal that they receive fundamentally from these managing agents, because I'd just be interested in whether there is evidence that has been enough to make a difference, or whether we should be realistic about the cap on what that change will bring in the wider problem.
I mean, fundamentally, there's going to have to be cultural change and changes in the market for both managing agents and people living in buildings. Managing agents are going to have to get used to putting residents at the centre of what they do, and leaseholders, residents of these buildings, are going to have to get used to taking responsibility for being in democratic control. So the law and regulation can only take you so far. But I think the evidence from other countries is where problems emerge, they are dealt with quickly. And that's because the people who live in the buildings are aware of them. So, for example, in Australia, where they have strata title, there have been issues, as there are here, with buildings being set up with long-term energy contracts for combined heat and power systems, which were unfavourable to the strata unit holders. And that was very quickly nipped in the bud. There was statutory reform, there was pressure on agents and energy companies to do something about it. And you compare the experience here, where Ofgem has belatedly taken over regulation of heat networks, which is basically what we're talking about, but we're still no closer to solving the problem. And it comes back to the point, it's because the people who pay the bills are not in charge. So I think once you make that change, there's pressure for rapid improvement whenever issues are identified.
Chris and then Lewis quickly.
Very quickly, Catherine. You talked about the need for a regulator that was independent and had teeth. Do you think it needs to be a new set-up regulator, or do you think it's something that can be done by an existing organisation?
We feel that it should be a totally new regulator, because the existing organisations who claim to regulate managing agents, sadly the evidence in our group is that that's not going very well. So I think it's really important that we have an organisation that is totally independent, as I said before, who can give meaningful penalties as well, not just a couple of hundred or a couple of £1,000 here and there. Yeah.
Would you be able to write to us with the evidence that suggests that they don't fulfil a regulatory function, or some case studies of that?
Yes.
Lewis.
And then just developing Sarah's question a bit more. Liam, you said that obviously if we have increased regulation, that's going to put up costs of service charge. And obviously I fully understand that if we move to Commonhold, that those people will have the power to hire and fire, so that will improve some of the management agents out there. But if we don't have any regulation, how does that power improve anything for existing leaseholders if there are no regulations around that? Don't you think we need to give people the power to hire and fire and regulation as well? Because all the management agents I come across are all terrible.
Yeah. Standards are uniformly low across the market. But I think if we make it easier for existing leasehold buildings to take over, you start introducing that market discipline. What I would be very wary of is introducing a system of regulation without teeth that only passes on costs to leaseholders and doesn't produce results, which I'm afraid is the model freeholders and managing agents are advocating for. And there is a proposal on the table, the regulation of property agents, to certify senior managers. That won't deliver anything. The senior managers of these managing agents have got nothing but contempt for leaseholders. So you're going to need a very heavy regulatory system to achieve any results, which is going to be expensive and bureaucratic to implement. And I think the best way to do it is to impose the discipline of the market. I think that's the only realistic way you'll solve these problems.
Mm. Thank you very much. I think we could spend a whole session talking about managing agents. Thank you for coming before the committee this morning. We'll continue to engage with you as we go through this inquiry. Could I ask for our next two speakers to come forward, please? Could I ask our two guest speakers to introduce themselves, please?
My name is Harry Scoffin. I'm the founder of Free Leaseholders. I'm also the Deputy Chair of a Residents Association and Director of a Right to Manage company of a block in East London.
Hi, my name is Halima Ali. I'm the Joint Campaign Coordinator for Homeowners' Rights Network, and we campaign exclusively about privately managed estates.
Thank you very much. Will.
Thank you, Chairman. A straightforward question to kick off. The government says that this draft bill will bring the feudal leasehold system to an end. Do you think it will, particularly in regard to ground rent and the fact that it doesn't regulate property management companies.
They also say that leasehold will be a feature of the housing market for many years to come. And if you're protecting ground rent until 2068, you're basically sending a big signal to people that have bought up the freeholds to other people's homes that this system is okay. And actually what I think we're so worried about is there's a crisis in the flats market at the moment. People cannot sell, they cannot move on. There's been a myriad of articles in the press where you've now got the biggest gap between house and flat prices in 30 years. The first rung, and actually often it's the last rung for elderly downsizers, is toxic. No one wants to touch it. The government are talking about 1.5 million new homes. The fact is most of those homes are going to be flats, particularly with immigration because of the demand for housing. If you've got a toxic tenure, you've got to get rid of it. That's what was promised in the manifesto. And in the bill, it's shorn of the Law Commission recommendations on enfranchisement and right to manage. So for our supporters, Commonhold, great for new builds, but for those of us already trapped in the system, Commonhold's going to be a mirage because you can't buy your freehold. You can't get right to manage under this legislation. And actually, it's silent on the process for buying the freehold, which is already in law, the 2024 Act, which they're hiding behind a judicial review, which they won in October. And that's what our concern is that people are going to be trapped in a two-tier market. Everyone's going to rush to Commonhold flats to juice the profit margins of developers, maybe on a Help to Buy 2.0 scheme, and those of us are going to be trapped. And actually, Hamptons just on Monday has come out and said service charges, 37% of flats now are in excess of 1% of the property price. What that means is those flats are unmortgageable, they're unsellable. So that's our concern, that you're going to be trapped in leasehold, and actually it's Commonhold for new, but they're going to basically keep us trapped.
So I just want to say that, first of all, it's really important to make the distinction with us and leaseholders. We are not leaseholders. Our issues are not related to tenure, is related to land and property law, and we need this conflation to stop. What we have are two separate issues that require different remediation. If I can just continue. So we are not dealing with communal spaces, we are dealing with public spaces and public infrastructure, which homeowners like myself are left to deal with, which is unfair, exploitative and unacceptable. The only way to help us is to legislate for retrospective universal adoption. Our position is supported by the CMA and is an evidence-based position. Managing agents for us is a symptom, is not the cause. So merely regulating managing agents will not help us at all. And in our situation is being led by developers. That's what we've gathered from our campaign.
Thank you both for that. That's been really helpful. The fact that the government has come to a compromise position with this bill, I assume, is because they're mindful of a legal challenge over sort of existing property rights. Would you like the government to be more aggressive, clamping down on ground rents amongst other things, even though that could risk a legal challenge?
If you send a thank you card to the freeholder lobby, they will sue you. The fact is, Parliament's sovereign. Labour's got the second biggest majority in its 126-year history. If they've promised voters one thing, they've got to deliver it. And this isn't a partisan point. We saw it with the Conservatives. They gave us partial legislation that they dragged out to the end of the Parliament. And what we're really worried about is Labour playing the same game, because the number 10 and the Treasury have been captured by these cartels, these interests. It's huge.
You have evidence of that, Henry?
You can see it in the media. Treasury has been pushing back against this. If you look at the ground rents policy statement, they're not publishing the full results of the consultation that everyone filled in good faith. They haven't done that, and they're using all the lobby lines about pension funds. Yuan Yen did a great thing where she was scrutinising the housing minister a few weeks ago in a joint...
We've asked the minister for that information.
Yeah.
Hopefully that will be forthcoming.
Great.
So we'll be able to share that.
But it's less than 1% of pension funds involved in residential property. This is get out your microscope territory, and yet they're worried about the guys that own 2.5% capital value. You're going to hear from Charmaine shortly. I don't want to preempt her evidence. That's the Residential Freehold Association. These guys own a tiny fraction of value, but they've got the whip hand over the running costs of people's homes. That's wrong. And we need to move to Commonhold. And what we're worried about is we're going to be sent down a wild goose chase about this draft legislation when we've already got law. And Parliament, beyond your committee, is not holding the government to account on that legislation. Because if there's powers that are in that legislation which is setting the rates to make it cheaper for leaseholders to extend a lease or buy the freehold, we were promised by the Housing Minister in November 2024 that that would be coming forward for a public consultation because they don't want to be sued. Last summer, didn't happen. They said they had to wait for the High Court judicial review decision. That came and went in October for the government. It's not happened. And this is really important because if we play the same game that what happened last time, the reforms aren't going to get done. And for us, why are they not bringing forward the Law Commission recommendations? That to me seems like the lobbyists have got their way. And they have got the influence in this system.
We'll come back to the Law Commission recommendations. Lewis, very quickly before I bring in Sean.
But you're very passionate. So what do you want to happen? It's succinctly, in a couple of sentences, what do you want to happen, or what do you think is not in this bill?
You've got to set the rates, the deferment rates and the capitalisation rates high, because at the moment the freeholders are lobbying to set those low. That's in the 2024 Act. You can do that. You also need to make sure that people that don't qualify to buy the freehold at the moment can take mixed-use buildings. Personal experience in that. If you've got a shared plant room or a pipe that connects you to commercial premises, you're out. Even if, under the 2024 Act, you've got a majority of floor space. There were a number of MPs and peers in the last Parliament that raised this. The last government looked at it, the election called out those reforms. Another thing, to get 50% of a block is almost impossible, particularly big blocks, but buy-to-let is a fact of life now. Most popular business. Let's reduce that threshold. And also another thing that the Law Commission originally recommended, but it looked like they had been pressured by vested interests, was to make sure that if you missed the boat to buy your freehold first, you could later on buy your share later on. Because what we've got at the moment is if you don't fit your 50%, you say something's gone on at work or you can't afford it at that moment, you're locked out from buying your share later on. Now, with the government mandating Commonhold and new flats, mortgage lenders and buyers will look and think, oh, this block has got the freehold, but these flats are not part of the decision-making process. That needs to change. So that's a big thing. But set the rates high, because what the freeholders are doing, they want the low rates. And that means that leaseholders will be paying more than the current position. And another thing...
That's not this Act, that's 2024 Act.
Correct, but Matthew Pennycook recognised that the 2024 Act was deficient in some ways. It didn't guide the Secretary of State to set the rates high. So he moved an amendment that was rejected by the Conservatives, bring that amendment forward, so that actually the base has to be something called Sportelli. Sportelli is freeholder-friendly case law, which basically is 4.7% for houses, 5% for flats, goes to 6% capitalisation rate. We want those rates much higher. But if it has to be a floor, have that as the absolute floor. So leaseholders are not paying more than the current position.
Thank you.
Halima, you've given a taste of sort of your view on the draft bill with regards to estate charges, and that ultimately adoption is what you. I'm interpreting from what your response to that is ultimately what you see as the sort of what's needed in order to sort of end a lot of this injustice. Obviously, the bill does sort of though remove some of the possession threats that homeowners face. I'm interested in, have you had experience of this, or are people you represent, have they had experience, and could you talk to that, please?
Yeah. Sorry. Right, so threats of one-to-one remedies, they were commonly reported to us 4 to 5 years ago, and mainly directed at mortgage lenders, who then started insisting on deeds of variations for sales and remortgages. So it's less often reported now. It is the most bare minimum we expected in order to help us. Is
it something that's actually happened, or is it just a couple of extreme cases?
Yeah, I'd say is the extreme cases. We're not hearing reports of it happening. Right. We have heard of reports where sale of homes have there's been threats that they're going to stop it. People not getting their mortgages, but it's not something that's happening widespread.
Are there any other changes that you think, apart from, aside adoption, are there any other changes in this bill that to the bill that you think would improve it with regards to private management, estate management?
The focus needs to move away from regulating managing agents for us. That is not going to help us. And we're saying
not
that,
regulating management?
For us, it's not going to help us. It's just going to keep us in a situation which, I'm sorry, I've been in mine for 16 years. I don't know how long I'm expected to continue to be exploited like this, to be punished for buying a home, and this is happening all over the UK.
So what key change would you see? Would you want to see?
Well,
if it's not regulating management agents, what is the change that you would like to see ultimately?
What we need to see is central government providing support to local government to have this conversation, to accept responsibility. They've put us in this mess, and they need to help us get out of it.
Thank you. Obviously, one of the areas is around with the Law Commission, and in the draft bill, the government haven't included the Law Commission recommendations. If you were to look at some of the recommendations in that, which one would you prioritise, Harry?
Well, one of the key ones is a restriction on development value, and this is why it's a systemic issue. The Conservatives promised it in 2021. It's in Robert Jenrick's written statement to Parliament. Then we get the 2024 Act, which was presented as a bill. The government forgot to cover their tracks, because in the impact assessment, it's referred to as one of the policies in the bill. It never made the 2024 Act. And why that's important is, even though there are really good policies in the 2024 Act, like removing marriage value, restricting ground rents 0.1%, not paying the landlord's legal and valuation fees, we understand that if the restriction on development value is not in this legislation, many, if not a majority of flat leaseholders will never be able to buy their freehold. And why that's important is, under the law at the moment, the freeholder can quite legally say, look, you've got a right, I'm selling the freehold, but I could build a skyscraper in the garden, you need to pay me £1 million extra. And the point is that needs to stop. And the Law Commission recommended it in that 2020 report. It was what the Conservatives promised, it didn't happen. Beyond that, there has to be a simplification of right to manage. Because if the government, as they're saying, is leasehold will be a feature of the housing market, forget all this diversionary tactic of regulating managing agents that I'm sure we'll come on to. You've got to give control to the homeowners that are paying the bills. Because as soon as you do that, the freeholder's not going to abuse them. And that's the key thing. Right to manage at the moment, we were in tribunal last year. We saw a case where leaseholders spent £150,000 to defend their right to manage, which is a no-fault right. It should be easy. And the barrister was licking his lips, and he said he worked on the Law Commission work. And he said we wouldn't be having this hearing today if the reforms to right to manage are brought in. It was almost as if he knew that the government were not going to be bringing in the right to manage reforms. That is really important, because at the moment there are so many traps, there's so much red tape. If you file the notice on one leaseholder incorrectly, the tribunal has no power to waive that. So we have to get rid of that. We also have to remove the onerous 50% participation threshold. So the last government, they were going to bring forward an amendment had the election not been called, because people like Barry Gardiner had raised an amendment, multiple MPs and peers raised this. We shouldn't have 50%.
What should it be?
Well, there should be a power for the Secretary of State to bring it down. There was almost a cross-party consensus to 35% or a third. Rachel Blake MP, she's even done a private member's bill on this, which is rather good. And also assuming that leaseholders want the right to manage, so there's a presumption in favour. And also, you could even do something called implied terms in leases, where you say that every leaseholder in that block has given their consent to be a member of the company. That would be a huge game changer. So we need to move to right to manage in this bill. But the key thing is getting those rates set fairly, and the fact that Pennycook understood that in opposition, and it's not in this bill, that worries us. To actually guide the Secretary of State to set the rates high, or at least no lower than the Supportelli rates.
Halima.
So for me, for us, I just want to drive this point home, that regulation of managing agents will not work, because what residents like myself are left with are open-ended liabilities. We don't even have that in our own property. So to have that expectation of us to maintain a wider estate, is just so fundamentally unacceptable and unfair. We can't predict the costs of these open-ended liabilities. The only thing that can be capped are the managing agent fees, and we see no evidence of that happening. I mean, just to give you example, just in the past 2 years, my estate managing fee is increased by £4,000, and there's nothing's improved. Not even the basic service that we're getting. Regulating agents does not tackle the fundamental injustice of the fact that estate residents are paying to maintain public amenities and infrastructure.
Thank you both for coming in your passionate views and concerns on this area. Like I said, we'll continue to engage with you throughout this inquiry. Order. Can I get our next two guest speakers? Witness from the Residential Freehold Association, who's here to represent its members. As a committee, we also invited Times Investment and Grosvenor to give evidence this morning alongside the RFA, so that the views of both freeholders and investors could be heard. Time Investment declined to appear before the committee. Grosvenor also declined to appear, but they have since written to us that they'll be able to attend in a few weeks. But both organisations have submitted written evidence, which we will be considering. But I just want to state on record that it is very disappointing at Times Investment declined to attend and be able to put their views forward. Charmaine, could you introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, committee. My name's Charmaine McQueen-Prince, and I'm Group Counsel for Wallace Partnership Group, who own approximately 100,000 leasehold properties. I'm a solicitor and I specialise in residential property and building safety, and I have experience of 20 years. My job is to get the best outcomes for our buildings and for people living in our buildings. I'm also the chair of the Leasehold Reform Subcommittee for the Residential Freehold Association. The RFA is a trade body representing professional freeholders, and together we are responsible for 1 million properties across the UK. The RFA promotes upholding best practice and professional standards. I should also just mention that Wallace Partnership Group responded to the call for evidence and submitted its own evidence.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. Andrew.
Good morning, Charmaine, welcome. The Residential Freehold Association, in their comments after the draft bill was published, said the inclusion of a ground rent cap in the draft Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Bill represents a wholly unjustified interference with existing property rights, which, if enacted, would seriously damage investor confidence in the UK housing market and send a dangerous and unprecedented signal to the wider institutional investment sector. Do you stand by that? And which aspects of the draft bill are RFA members opposed to, and which do they support?
The RFA supports the government's objectives to ensure that the housing sector is fair, responsible, and helping ordinary people living in their homes with the cost of the building safety. Helping ordinary people living in their homes with the cost of living crisis. That's what we support.
Does that include when residents and leaseholders' bills increase from £50 to £250 overnight for ground rent, which they receive no service?
In terms of ground rent, I should probably explain, and I'm sure the committee are aware of this, ground rent will increase periodically. So if you have a ground rent that's £50, it's likely that your ground rent will not then increase for a period, and it might be 20 years or 25 years. So it's important to understand that it increases periodically. In terms of ground rent increases, they will be detailed in the lease. So when you buy a lease, your lease will specify your ground rent. It may well be a fixed ground rent, or it may be a ground rent that it increases by RPI, but it will be detailed in your lease, and that lease is something that would have been reviewed by the solicitor that you instructed when you originally bought your lease.
Thank you. I will come back to ground rent, but I'd just like to, if you could just state what aspects of the legislation RFA members are opposed to and what they support, if you would.
We have deep concerns. We are deeply concerned about the bill and its unintended consequences. We have three main concerns, and they relate to the ground rent cap. Firstly, the risk of insolvency. If a freeholder becomes insolvent, they won't be able to carry out their obligations. They have a number of obligations that are listed in the lease, but most importantly, cladding, their obligations towards cladding, their obligations towards fire safety. If a freeholder is insolvent, they can't carry out those obligations. Those works that are currently being undertaken across the country will come to a halt, and leaseholders will be living in dangerous buildings. Secondly, pension funds will be impacted by this cap. The cap will create a transfer of wealth from small and large UK pension funds to buy-to-let investors. That can't be what this draft bill seeks to do. And thirdly, the impact on investor confidence in UK PLC. Investors will be unsettled by the retrospective nature of this bill. This can't be the government's objectives, but these are the unintended consequences. And if the committee would like me to just take them through the impacts on leaseholders of the cap, the impact on pension funds as a result of the cap, or the impact on investment in the UK, I'm happy to do that.
So we'll come back to that if there's time. So is it your contention that what leaseholders receive in exchange for their ground rent is removal of combustible cladding? Is that your argument? What else do they receive in exchange for their ground rent?
Ground rent is a rent for the land that the flat sits on. That's number one. Number two, ground rent is also part of the price, the purchase price of the lease, which is spread out across the lease term. That is what ground rent is. And in terms of what landlords do, landlords' obligations are detailed in the lease. Landlords' obligations are also detailed in legislation, the Building Safety Act, the Housing Act, the Fire Safety Act, and Landlord and Tenant Act. That's where you see landlords, what landlords do. But also, it's important to understand what landlords do behind the scenes. At the moment, landlords are entering into and overseeing massive, complex building safety remediation projects.
Which they've received over £1 billion in funding under the previous government. Lord Gove has sat behind us, but they received over £1 billion in funding to deal with that. And the Building Safety Act does require leaseholders to contribute towards that as well. What I'm asking you, ground rent has been in place for quite a long time. What do people receive in exchange for their ground rent? Because the Competition and Markets Authority couldn't find any persuasive evidence that was commercially necessary, nor could they find any persuasive evidence that consumers received anything in return. What in your view do you receive in exchange for your ground rent?
What leaseholders are getting is the competence of a professional freeholder. They're getting their expertise. They're getting teams of people who are committed to making sure that people are safe in their homes. So just going...
Our inboxes as MPs would say something very different. Because
I know there was laughter behind you when you said competence as well. But
yeah.
I understand that your inboxes will be full of complaints about managing agents and some rogue freeholders. I understand that, and I'm not denying that that's the case. But we do think that, managing agents should be regulated. We often hold managing agents' feet to the fire about poor performance, about their financial management, about their operational delivery. That's what freeholders do behind the scenes. And so I just want to continue and just let you know what we do behind the scenes. So again, we are overseeing these massive remediation projects that are lasting maybe 6 to 18 months. And in terms of paying for remediation, many landlords are paying for remediation because the funds do not support fire stopping and compartmentation. And a lot of the buildings that we own have those problems. We're also holding developers' feet to the fire and asking them to come to the table, whatever size the building is, and we're asking them to remediate these buildings that you designed and that you constructed, whether they're low-rise, medium-rise or high-rise. That's what we are doing. We're sitting with MPs, we're attending residents' meetings as well. We're also stepping in when right-to-manage companies and RMCs are finding it really difficult to manage these buildings because it's pretty tough, and that's not what they are trained to do. We are stepping in and taking over that management at the request of these RTMs and RMCs.
Thank you. Andrew.
So successive governments have made similar manifesto commitments on leasehold reform and ground rent caps over several parliaments. Do you accept that there is a clear mandate from the public, from the electorate, to pursue these reforms?
I think that some leaseholders want the government to pursue these reforms, but I think that the government has its own evidence of where leaseholders have been quite happy with the leasehold or neutral about leasehold, and because they're not really interested in picking up the management. What they want to do is come home, live in a safe building and go to work. They're not interested in managing. And one of the things I think is important is if we do move to Commonhold, we're taking away people's rights to live in a building where they don't have management obligations. And there are some people who don't want management obligations. They just want to live in their buildings and make sure they're getting reasonable service charge and are safe.
And would you argue that the majority of people receive that? Because the reason why many people do make complaints is because they're not getting that service. They're being charged over the odds for services. They do not get a response from the managing agent until we as MPs haul those managing agents before Parliament, before we raise it in the chamber, before we write many letters, in some cases having to make those letters public before the managing agents will then have the courtesy to respond to those residents. That's why those residents don't want to take on the stress of managing their buildings. Would you agree with that?
I do agree that there are some poor managing agents. I do agree with that. I agree that managing agents should be regulated. We wholly support Lord Best's ROPA report. We've been saying that managing agents should be regulated for some time.
A number of colleagues indicating, but I'll let Andrew finish.
Yes, thank you. I just want, just for my final point, because I know we're short on time. You talked about the risk to pension funds. I think the predecessor department from HCLG, their analysis was that less than 1% of pension fund investments were invested in residential properties. So isn't the risk of collapse of pension fund investments overstated?
I'm not a pension fund investor expert, but what I can say is there are loads of different types of pensions, okay, and pension investors. You have your big institutional investors, you have your charities, you have your small investors, and you have your husband and wife team who may have bought a building with 3 flats or may have bought another building with 3 flats, and that was their pension. It's the impact of this piece of legislation or this draft piece of legislation across the board, not just the big institutional pension funds. And so this piece of legislation is likely to ensure that there are huge losses. Some funds have already suspended activity in trading because of the uncertainty around ground rents. There will be huge write-downs because of this piece of legislation if it goes forward. Some pensions will not be able to meet their liabilities, and funds may become risky. Can I just give you some statistics if you don't mind?
If there's time, Chair.
Can I?
Very quickly, please.
Okay. So the government stats confirm that 41% of leasehold properties are privately rented. 41%. So that means that they are buy-to-let investors. They are not people living in their own homes. So freeholders, including pension funds and their savers, will see a huge transfer of wealth to buy-to-let investors and very wealthy domestic and overseas leaseholders and property investors. And I'd really like to share some really good examples to give you an understanding of what this looks like.
We are short of time. Maybe it would be helpful if you write to us as a committee and we can include that in our evidence and submissions. Sean and Sarah.
Just two quick questions, Chair. My colleague, Mr. Cooper, asked twice. Okay, one then. I'll make it a key one. Something together. My colleague, Mr. Cooper, asked twice what aspects of the bill RFA members support. You were very quick and labelled 3 things you oppose. Shall I take from the fact that you didn't answer which bits of the bill you support that RFA members don't support any aspects of the bill?
We're concerned about a number of aspects of the bill. I've just talked about...
So is that a yes then? You don't support any aspects of the bill?
There's not many aspects of the bill. We are concerned about the unintended consequences of the bill, and we think that it's really important to get those out and share that now that we're scrutinising the bill.
Sarah.
As a leaseholder, and involved in a property where we also have to oversee the managing agent ourselves, please tell me what I am doing wrong in seeking any service from my freeholder, who seems to, and categorically has, only written to me every year to tell me how much I owe them. There is zero service being provided to myself and to no doubt many people sitting behind you here today. It is rare that we have this many people turn up to a hearing because the level of frustration is so palpable in terms of how the current system is operating. But yes, please do explain how me and no doubt many others are missing out on this magical service we can receive from our freeholders.
I'm sorry that your experience of your freeholder has been really difficult. I'm sorry to hear that, but I do know that I'm coming from a background where I've worked with this particular freeholder for I think it's about nearly 2 years, and we really try hard. We go to residents' meetings. You know, if we get complaints, we answer them. If we get letters from MPs, we answer them. We often try to meet up with MPs to talk about how living in buildings could be better. And, you know, I've sat here and earlier discussed what we do behind the scenes, and I think it's really important to talk about what we do behind the scenes. And I've talked about building safety. I've talked about funding remediation measures, funding alternative accommodation, all of these things. Sorry, that's in terms of building safety. But in terms of right to manage or RMCs, we support right to manage and RMCs in building safety situations.
I have to move on. Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. And look, first of all, Charmaine, thank you for coming to give evidence. As the Chair set out, there are others who might want to be defending a similar position who weren't brave enough to do so. So I think that should be recognised at least. I want to take us back, though, to fire safety, and this is a really important point of clarification. I thought you were giving the committee the impression that paying a ground rent is somehow equivalent to a sinking fund that contributes to remedial works. That's not the case, and it's really, really important that we establish that. So can you confirm ground rents do not go in a sinking fund that pays to remedial work for fire safety?
No, what we're saying is that, for example, there are buildings that have unsafe external walls, and yes, we are benefiting from government funding, but those same buildings have fire safety issues internally. They've got compartmentation issues. Those defects are not covered by the funding, and they have to be paid for. And those are the things that we are paying for. In terms of waking watches, where people have to, you know, guard the buildings, we are paying for waking watches. If people...
Yeah, I think...
please, everyone.
I think perhaps on that, Charmaine, if you had any evidence of examples of where freeholders have taken the financial hit themselves and not charged the leaseholders in order to
It's in the Building Safety Act. It's in the Building Safety Act.
Okay. And the second question I had, you had an interesting phrase about the transfer of wealth in respect to buy-to-let. Interesting and perhaps a courageous choice, because I think most of the evidence we said today is that the real transfer of wealth at the moment is going the other way. It's from leaseholders who live in these buildings to freeholders at the moment. And I just do want to say, look, we've had a lot of questions. I think there is a feeling in this room and more broadly in this debate that there is perhaps some scaremongering coming from your side of the argument, and this is a good example of that. And how do you respond?
I give you an example. So the winners and losers, example one, and these are real world examples. Expensive flat in London valued at £4 million, Hanover Terrace. The ground rent is £5,000. The ground rent cap will mean that that ground rent is reduced to £250. That leaseholder that owns that flat will gain £420,000 over the transition period. Example 1. Example 2. An RFA member holds a 125-year head lease of a trade union building. The ground rent is £12,000 per annum. The ground rent will be capped at £250. The trade union will lose approximately £3.8 million over the life of the lease. That is what this bill will do.
If that's the case, why did the RFA wait until a week before the bill was published to raise these concerns? You've had all this time, you've got all this information.
I think, with respect, Chair, we weren't aware of what the bill was going to say. We weren't, we've now been told it's a ground rent cap of £250 with a transitional period of 40 years, and now what we're doing is understanding what the legislation is and working out what the impacts are going to be.
Even though the former government floated that, and then there was widespread press reports, obviously you have to go by what the government lay. Even with that, you did not feel that it was right to raise any relevant concerns.
I think that we have raised concerns about the ground rent cap, and we've responded to the consultation on ground rent. I think we're still awaiting the response to that, but a ground rent cap has been raised several times by the RFA and its members.
Andrew.
I think I'm happy.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. I'd just suggest it was quite a good manifesto. It would have been nice if some of your members had read it, because it was definitely in there. Yeah. If this legislation were to pass in its current form, do you expect your members would seek to bring a judicial review regarding any of its provisions?
The RFA wants to focus on making this bill workable for freeholders and leaseholders. That's why we're here, and that's why we've responded. We do want to assist government with this.
Let's assume it goes in its current form. Let's just simplify the argument. Do you think that there will then be a judicial review?
We are deeply concerned by the unintended consequences, and I've managed to lay some of them down today.
We've heard that, but let's assume that you aren't successful in winning that argument, and I'm sure many of your members would be frustrated by that. What do you think their next step will be? Do you think it will be going to a judicial review?
We have a number of members. I'm not in a position to comment on whether they will seek judicial review. They will take their own advice, but I think all they will do is probably look at the legislation and see how it impacts their business and what they do.
Okay, so let's imagine that the legislation does go through in its current state and there is a judicial review brought by your members, and I appreciate that you're not in a place in order to say they'll do that. Do you think that, as a lawyer, do you think their case will be substantially different to the case which Freeholders brought against the LAFRA?
I'm not a public lawyer, so I can't comment on that, and I would want to take advice on that. But what I will say is LAFRA sought to cap enfranchisement premiums. This legislation seeks to cap ground rent. When freeholders purchase buildings subject to long leases with ground rent provisions, expecting those ground rent provisions to be available for the lifetime of the lease, but this legislation is going to stop that.
Is Wallace Partnership Group seeking permission to appeal the ruling from October?
Yes.
Which other claimants are pursuing further litigation concerning LAFRA?
Are you referring to the JR?
Yeah.
It will be all of the appellants, I think. All of the claimants on that list.
It's notable again, as the chair started with, that we found it difficult to get freeholders to come and sit before us. Why do you think it is that we do find it so difficult? And is it because you think that these people, rather than try, and come back to the previous question, rather than trying to deal with the legislative process from democratically elected members of Parliament, there is instead a process of trying to use the legal system to undermine the decisions that are made by democratically members of this elected Parliament?
We often speak to members of Parliament and have meetings. And
it's unfortunate, but
I'm just answering the question. We often speak to members of Parliament and have meetings. Today I volunteered to come, and one of the reasons why I volunteered to come was because I know how hard I work. I know how hard some of my team works, and I know how hard we're working to make sure that buildings are safe and people are safe. And that is why I'm here today.
There was a question I earlier asked about the sort of will of the people. What percentage of the public do you think oppose the changes that we're making to leasehold reform?
Who's opposed to change? I don't know.
10%, according to you, Gove. 1 in 10. Overwhelming support from the British public for what we're trying to do here.
Sorry, where can we find that detail?
Polling results are available on the YouGov website.
Mm-hmm.
He's an ex-pollster, so I wouldn't argue with him.
Yeah, again, very quickly.
Really short question, if I may. What value does ground rent offer to people?
And I think it's what freeholders do. It's our stewardship role. It's our careful management, our careful, responsible management.
We're getting management fee and service charge, which presumably...
We don't get management fee. Management fee will be received by the managing agent. All the freeholder will get is the ground rent income and any income that it might get from enfranchisement.
A little bit confused, but I'm sure we'll have further evidence sessions on the value.
Well, Andrew, finally.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about the government's estimates of the value transfer that they published in the policy paper. So I think they estimated a value transfer for a transitional period of 40 years of between 55% and 61% between freeholders and leaseholders, and it set out modelling based on a 20-year transitional period and a 60-year transitional period so that you could see the difference between the two. Do you agree or disagree with the government's assessment on the estimated value transfer?
I think it's difficult to comment without seeing the impact assessment or any detailed information that resulted in those figures. Again, I'm unable to comment on the financial impact of RFA members, but what I do want to say about that table is that it doesn't show the different types of freeholder, and I think that's really important. The small investors, the pension funds, it doesn't show the different types of leaseholders, the ordinary leaseholder who owns their own home, the buy-to-let investors, the wealthy and the super rich. It needs to be more detailed. It needs to be drilled down. It doesn't show the unintended consequences of this draft legislation, the impact on leaseholders if freeholders become insolvent, the impact on pensions and those who lose out, the windfall for buy-to-let investors and the windfall to the super rich, domestic and overseas.
Okay.
And the bad outcomes at the expense of ordinary leaseholders and UK pensioners.
Okay. Previously, governments have considered an immediate peppercorning for existing ground rents. Do you consider that a 40-year change to peppercorn is a reasonable compromise?
No, we would, we have concerns with this bill, number one, but the 40 years transition, some of our members may well have 30, 40, 50, 60-year loan notes or 70-year loan notes. So having a 40-year transition period may not work for everybody. Also, if you're asking us to look at our business again, then, nobody's interested in ground rents anymore. This isn't something that we could just say, okay, let's sort out now. It's, as Harry said, it's been toxified. Ground rent is toxified. Leasehold is toxified. This isn't something that we'll be able to sort out, quickly.
I'm just curious as to whether you can consider any other area of public policy ever where the government has offered a 40-year transition period for investors to adjust. This seems wildly generous, certainly to me and maybe to many members of this committee. Can you think of any other example?
I can't. But what I would say is if we wanted to make this bill better, and if the government is really intent on going down this road of reform, then we think that there are some perhaps improvements or things that the government should be considering. And they would be indexation of the cap, RPI or CPIH, because it would retain its value and it would be kept affordable. So the cap should be indexed. Also, target support that owner-occupiers. They benefit from the cap, but not the buy-to-let investors. Target support at ordinary people whose flats are in council tax band A and B. They benefit from the cap, but not the wealthy and the super rich living in really expensive properties, and extend the transitional period so we can try and unpick this.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine. We do appreciate you coming because, as I mentioned, we did write to others and they refused to appear, including Times Investment, and we look forward to hearing from Grosvenor when they appear before the committee. I think lastly, just to add that, you mentioned the issues around risk. We have many leaseholders who've put all their life savings into purchasing a home. Investments for your investors go up and down, so they should be fully aware of the risk, and I think 40 years is more than long enough for them to consider their investment. Order.
It's the obvious question, isn't it? Is it toxic?
Order. Could I get our two guests to introduce themselves, please?
Yes, I'm Michael Gove. I'm currently the editor of The Spectator, and I take the Conservative whip in the House of Lords. And I was Secretary of State at what was the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, now MHCLG, between 2022 and 2024. But I had 100 days off.
I'm Angela Rayner. I'm the MP for Ashton-under-Lyne, and I changed the department to MHCLG as Secretary of State following Michael there. And I've been a Member of Parliament since 2015, and it was one of my proposals that this bill legislation came forward.
Thank you both for appearing before the committee. Well,
Angela, before the draft bill was published, you called on the government to take meaningful action to tackle ground rents in line with the Labour manifesto. Do you think this compromise position outlined in the draft bill meets that manifesto commitment? And the government said that its draft bill is to bring an end to the feudal leasehold system. Do you think by this bill, by doing what it's outlined, but yet excluding ending the wild west of property managing agents, does that as well?
There's two kind of questions in there. First of all, I think this bill is going a very long way, and you'll have seen from the work that Michael did in the previous government and some of the interactions we've had since we've been in this session is the balancing act between getting these reforms put in, and it's over 1,000 years of ending that leasehold system that we've had. I do think it's going there. I think it's striking the balance. I think there's clear vested interests. I mean, the fact that only one would turn up, the freeholders and others who haven't bothered to turn up, and I think there was hints of where they want to go, and I think that, Chris, you were quite clear in trying to probe where they want to go in this, and that the Housing Minister has been really clear on what needs to happen. I think the lack of regulation for management agents is a real problem. I heard some of the evidence from others, but I do think we need to go further and harder on the Lord Best's proposals. But I think, in summary for me, is that the world's smallest violin for these organisations who think that ground rent, which is a freebie, is acceptable when people are in these conditions, and we do need to end it. And I think we have struck the right balance, and I think we should not be kowtowing or taking any lectures on this. I think we've got the mandate. I think the previous government went as far as they could in the wash-up in terms of the 2024 Act. I think we've got to switch those on, and I think we've got to move at pace.
Lord Gove, what do you think of this bill? And from your behind-the-scenes viewpoint, how do you think the previous government and this government have got the balance right by tackling some of the vested interests Angela's just talked about?
Thank you, Will. I'm delighted that the bill has been brought forward, and there are many, many good things to welcome in the bill, and both the current Secretary of State, Steve Reed, and Angela, as his predecessor, are to be commended. But, as will be apparent to members of this committee, the MHCLG Secretaries of State have been fighting against a rearguard action mounted by the freeholders and other financial interests and supported by the Treasury. I witnessed that myself when I was in government, and I think that the institutional resistance of the Treasury remains. I recognise that there's a limit to what Angela, as a supporter of the government, can say at the moment, but I'm liberated from that obligation. And I can say that it is striking, as Angela pointed out, that the freeholders will not show their face in front of this committee, a clear invitation to defend their interests that they will not take up. The previous witness was, I think, brave in coming along and made her case, I think, fairly and coherently, but it's unchivalrous at best and scandalous at worst that they ask someone else to make their case for them, because, as Angela pointed out, and as the committee is aware, for many years now they have benefited from a system whereby they get money for nothing, that the ground rent system is essentially extortion. It should end. The government will end it. I would far rather that it ended it on an accelerated timetable, but I recognise that there is only so much that an individual Secretary of State can do when financial institutions exercise such a spellbinding hold over Treasury decision makers.
Just on that, Lord Gove, obviously in early 24, the now Housing Minister, Minister Pennycook, was quite critical when you announced your policy,
yes,
when you were in favour of the 250 ground rent to transition. Could you just take us and bring about the reason and how you came to that decision when you were Secretary of State?
Yes, so first of all, I should say that, again, Matthew Pennycook in opposition made very strong arguments, and in government I know that he has, as far as I know, whatever is happening in government, been fighting the good fight. But Minister Pennycook, like the Secretary of State, like I, will face arguments being mounted from outside government and being amplified within government from people who say that, for example, moving to cap ground rents, moving rapidly to peppercorn, will undermine certain economic strengths of the United Kingdom. And we heard those from Charmaine earlier. She put the case very clearly. But those arguments, no matter how well put, are bogus. So the first thing to say is the impact on pension funds. Overall pension funds have less than 1% of their investment in residential property in the UK. That's residential property overall, never mind ground rents. So we're talking about a tiny amount of people's pension savings invested in this asset class. The second thing related to that is concern about spooking or chilling future investment. This was an argument I had a lot from the Freeholder lobby and from their allies within government. Again, I think that's nonsensical. Investors make a judgment about the attractiveness of the United Kingdom overall according to a variety of factors, and I think that people in the markets are big boys and girls. They will know that a government has absolutely every right to say the party is over when it comes to a return with no risk, and those investors will entirely appreciate that there are plenty of our other areas which will be more productive and higher yielding over time and more defensible, into which they can put their investment money. So these arguments seem to me to be bogus. And the final argument that was mounted is the idea that freeholders are fairy godmothers and fathers when it comes to building safety. The truth is quite the opposite. We in government had to pursue remediation orders against freeholders in order to get them to make sure that property was safe. Local authorities have had to do so since the general election, supported by Angela and by Steve Reed. If only these freeholders had acted beforehand without requiring legislation and public money to support them, then the argument might carry some weight. As it is, it's valueless.
And Angela, you were very vocal and supportive of the issues around building safety and your support for the Grenfell family and community and making sure all buildings are safe. Do you feel that the arguments in terms of all this wonderful ground rent that many freeholders have been receiving for many years is going towards remediation.
No, and I think it's absolute rubbish. I think Michael said it out quite clear. His government was clear on this and had to take action. It's like whack-a-mole. They all blame each other. It's not our fault. It's the other person's fault. It's the people that built the building. No, it's the freeholders that own the building. And all along, for years, people have been living in buildings that were inadequate and wasn't built correctly, and then they say it's not built correctly, but hey, it's not our problem it wasn't built correctly, and try and push the costs onto everybody else. So I don't accept that ground rents have given this mysterious amount of money that is remediating these buildings, because too often, and we still find it, I'm sure my Steve Reed, who has taken over the role that I have had, has been in the same rooms I have been in, saying we expect you to do this, why is it not being done quick enough? And that's why we came forward with more proposals on how we accelerate the remediation programme. But I'm sure Michael shares my frustration when we're in those rooms and these people are not actually looking at the human impact of people after what happened at Grenfell. And if it's your daughter or your son that is living in one of these buildings, and the previous speaker talked about, oh, well, we've got waking watchers. No, we need these buildings remediated. It's unacceptable. And I don't see that ground rents is an issue that they can hide behind. I think it's astonishing that they're trying.
Thank you. Gagan.
Lord Gove, love to see you as always. I think when we were in government, we weren't talking about a potential 40-year transition, but I think 20 years. Any views on the 40-year transition period being proposed?
Yes. So our former colleague, Lee Rowley, who was the minister who was bringing forward this legislation, worked hard in order to ensure that he could support leaseholders as effectively as possible. In the end, it was judged, after conversations with the Treasury and indeed the welcome intervention of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister, that 20 years was an appropriate period of time for the market to adjust. I think it's quite a generous 20-year transition period. This government has decided on 40 years. Again, I won't criticise MHCLG, but I do think it is the case, more broadly, taking a couple of steps back, that for this government, it is understandable that they wish to send a message internationally that the UK is a safe haven for investment. And so the argument that we've just heard will have been, don't destabilise existing investments too much. 40 years sends that appropriate signal. I think that is a mistaken argument. I can understand why people would be sympathetic to the argument for stability, but this is stability in the interests of those who are gouging money from our fellow citizens who have worked hard to acquire their own property. And it is not the sort of investment that is productive. It's not the sort of investment in equities or in innovation that any government would want to encourage. So I would hope that this committee would be able to persuade the Treasury that in at least one area, the Tories were right.
If I may, to both of you, ground rent is obviously a part of the relationship between leaseholders and freeholders. The glaring omission I think we've seen as a committee is the lack of legislation coming forward on service charge and managing agents. Any views on that?
Well, yes, I do think, like I say, that the regulation on management agents and Lord Best's proposals is absolutely right. And I think, to give credit to Lord Gove, the work that was done in the Wash Up and getting over the line on the 2024, there are glitches in it, and the Housing Minister has accepted that. And this is a highly litigal type of arena that we're in, is to ensure that we fix those glitches and that we can take those areas forward on service charges. It can cause challenges when you're looking at enfranchisement, so it's not as easy as we'd like it to be. But I certainly, my time in government, and I'm sure the Secretary of State now, and I certainly know from my relationship with the Housing Minister that this is something that they're wanting to tackle, and they want to do it with expedience and to avoid us being in a protracted situation. And I think, just coming back to the issue that Lord Gove was talking about in terms of the cap and then the period of time, I think one of the things that we're trying to do is strike the balance to get this over the line and to act immediately. I also think making sure that it is not inflationary linked, which you heard from the previous speaker about what they want that to be the case. I think we should resist that because it does bring it in, and I think it's that striking the balance. But I think that certainly on ground rents, we should be, service charges, we should be doing more to try and bring in the 2024 regs.
Michael, any views on service charge and managing?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there are many managing agents that provide a shocking service. I know from my own experience as a constituency MP, I'm sure Will have this also, because we have the constituency I represented and the constituency he represents are quite similar in lots of ways. Organisations like First Port that boast about their managing expertise are the bane of tens of thousands of people's lives. So Angela is right, Lord Best and others have done good work in this area, and there is more to do. But the other thing that I would also say is that the faster that we can move to a situation where, to coin a phrase, leaseholders can take back control, the better. And the more that they exercise their right to manage, the more that they are able to ensure that they have full control of their property and their investment, the better. That's why I think that the recommendations that were made by Harry Scoffin earlier are right. So, of course, we should look at regulating managing agents, and there are people who are not leaseholders who suffer as a result of managing agents handling things poorly. But I think that the points that Harry made about tackling development value, which of course some freeholders will use as a way of trying to extort more from leaseholders, and then looking at the deferment and capitalisation rates, as Harry mentioned earlier. These are important things. Technical detail, not sexy, but vital, and I know that the committee has been looking at them.
I'm just mindful of time, colleagues. I have a number of colleagues indicating if you can be very brief. Chris, Andrew L, Lee and Mayor.
Very quickly on the time period, Lord Gove. Forgetting the merits or otherwise of 20 years over 40 years, do you think that there is a legal factor to whether we should consider that time period, or do you not think that the time period is relevant to the legal debate?
There will be a legal factor. So it will be the case that the government will have received legal advice that the Freehold lobby will seek, as we've already seen that, to judicially review whatever Parliament decides, and they will, both within government and outside, say that the ECHR and the A1P1 Article 1 Part 1 rights to the defence of property are touched on here, and that therefore, if you delay the process or smooth the process, the risk of losing a judicial review diminishes. I understand that, but I think that it is better for a government, rather than taking a defensive crouch in the face of lawyers and the courts, to state clearly, this is Parliament's will, this is what the public want, this argument is right. Defending property rights is there to ensure that we don't have the individual feeling the weight of the state against them. These are not individuals, these are vested corporate interests, and it's the responsibility of Parliament to take those on.
Andrew.
Thank you both for being here. I'm enjoying this outbreak of political consensus. There's a serious point that actually I think a lot of people watching this will value it as well, two people with huge experience and passion on this. But I'm going to try and press you both a little bit further on the transition period, because you've talked with great experience about the dynamics between HCLG and the Treasury. But if each of you had the ear of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor today, what would your recommendation be on the length of that transition period? How many years?
Well, I would have the shortest possible. And
Michael, you're liberated. 20. Angela.
I agree with Michael. We should have the shortest period, but we also, it's not an ideal world, and we know we're going to end up in the situations. But my message to Treasury is the High Court rightly dismissed the freeholders' attempts to challenge parts of the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act, which was Michael's act. So we know their appetite, but we also know that we can win win the battle, and we should. And previous governments, including ours, have said we're going to do it, so we should get on and do it. And in response to the suggestions around pension funds and investment, we've already said that the government's own impact assessment suggests this could be as low as 1%. And freeholders often have diversified business interests. So I think some of the arguments to not do this completely falls away. And we've had successive governments saying they're going to do this. There is a political will. You can see that through myself and Michael being here as a double act today. And I think you've seen that through the will of the people in terms of the electoral mandate that we had to finish this job. And I think that too slower action on it will be damaging for us as a parliament, because it looks like the vested interests win over the will of the people. And quite frankly, it's not a political point, it's a right or wrong. And it's wrong what is happening, and therefore it's our duty to put it right.
Lee.
Angela, you spoke, I think, in response to Gagan's question about the service charges maybe coming later, or action around that. But if you were Secretary of State, would have we seen management companies regulated in this draft bill?
Well, there's a number of things that I think we could have put within the bill. I know there's been consultations around it and the bill is already long. And there's a balancing act between getting the bill through and other parts, like I say, the Act of 2024 can go some way towards that. So there is a balancing between how much is within that bill, and I think we are very clear on our recommendations around the Law Commission and making sure we implement them. So I think there's a number of avenues and ways to do it, but I want to see this bill not held up by vested interests and by us being able to take that forward, fix the glitches in the 2024 Act, which the Housing Minister has identified, and then take them forward as well.
It feels to me, you know, in my inbox is we were hoping this would be the panacea to fix those managing agents and the service charges, and I just feel that there will be lots of leaseholders out there who will be disappointed that the bill, you know, just hasn't gone far enough, quickly enough.
Both Angela and I obviously want more action faster, but one of the things which is just a constraint within government overall is that, as the committee knows, this is quite a technical area of law, and it is also the case that there's a limit, I think a wrongly artificial limit, on the number of people who are employed in writing legislation in the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. They work incredibly hard, but there are other people in government who keep that number deliberately low in order to reduce the pipeline of potential legislation. So in a hard-pressed department like MHCLG, which I think is responsible for more legislation than any other government department at the moment, and just changing more, there is simply that constraint. And so while I completely share your impatience, it's just difficult for a government department to achieve everything that it wants so quickly.
Mayor, then Lewis.
Thanks, Ruth. I've got a brief question on the cultural shift from leasehold to Commonhold. And we've had the RFA earlier saying that people potentially don't want to manage themselves. I think it's a fair argument that from a lot of the testimony we've heard today that it's a fair cost to manage themselves if it means that they can avoid some of the horrible situations they've had. But equally, we arguably have a culture that's shifting to not particularly engaging with our neighbours as much as they have been. So I just wonder, National Leasehold Campaign said earlier about, actually Commonholders aren't getting any training or support. So I just wonder what you see the role of government, both locally and nationally, in sort of education and cultural support around this. Is a big shift and in my view a great shift, but do you think people, the everyday person with a Commonhold, is going to feel comfortable engaging with their neighbours on that kind of regular basis, and how can we support that? I think there's a lot we could do to support it, and there's organisations out there already, and quite frankly, as Liam said, that I think his description was the dinosaurs looking at the asteroid, but I'd like to see the regulation of management agents and a new culture around the Commonhold and how we can support that. I get that people don't want to be managing their building, but people don't want to be ripped off, and it's not either or, it's not a binary choice. There is a very well, if we regulate it, if we get it right, where people can do that. And, people like Liam and Harry and others who have given evidence today, the tenacity and the bravery of the years and years of them really taking on these big interests that are willing to litigate and willing to grind individuals into the ground, you could see that there's an appetite, and I think we should be encouraging more of that.
Yes, I mean, again, the leasehold system has been described as feudal because of the way in which it operates. But this argument is literally feudal. It is saying you've gone to the trouble of buying this property, taking out a mortgage, acquiring your flat, but you are a serf, incapable of taking these really tough decisions about how to manage your property, and you need us to do it for you. We're talking about adults. We're talking about their principal investment and their own home, and the idea that they need to have Firstport or someone else to ensure that they will have their property looked after effectively, I think is for the birds. It's also saying, uniquely, English people in flats can't do that. In France, in the Netherlands, yes, of course you can have people working together to look after a flat, but in England, you need to have the Duke of Westminster doing it for you. Look, I love dukes. That's one of the reasons I'm a Tory. But you don't need to have a member of the House of Lords being responsible for your property in order to manage it effectively.
Lewis, very quickly, please.
Yeah, I just want to follow up from Lee's question, Angela, because she didn't particularly answer it, and you're not usually shy of giving us your opinion. So let's roll back. Your Secretary of State, what is missing from the bill that you would have ensured would be in the bill if you were Secretary of State today?
Well, like I say, I think there's fixes within the 2024 Act which will help with service charges. I think there's a challenge in regards to how that can affect the enfranchisement, so it's not quite as easy as one would hope, and that needs to be pushed forward. There is the Lord Best's proposals on the regulation around management agents, which I think needs to be taken forward. But on balance, I commend the Housing Minister, who has been around for a very long time and seen a number of housing ministers, over a dozen, come and go, and has been consistent in this. And I believe that he's working in good faith and at pace to get the balance right to end this system. And I think that the evidence that we've heard today just, I think, crystallises and shows you where the debate is and where the challenges are. And I think that, in the most binary way, we've got a choice between the vested interests or the people that feel like they're being shafted and they feel like we need to get on and do something about it. And I'm with the people that are saying, and I absolutely agree, that we're being ripped off. And that has to end. And I think that the Housing Minister and the Secretary of State are commendable, and what Michael did in 2024 in taking on those vested interests and making fairness at the heart of this bill.
So at this moment in time, you wouldn't have gone any further than what the bill currently proposes to do.
I mean, if he had a huge amount of time, as Michael says, in terms of legislation. I mean, when I was Secretary of State, the proposed legislation that is coming forward is some of the meatiest and the most largest amount of legislation that we're bringing forward, and I don't apologise for that. The Renters' Rights Act was incredibly important legislation, and so therefore, of course it would be great to put more things within that bill. I've just outlined some of them, but I do think that what is in there is going to be a game changer for people who have waited far too long for that action to be taken.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thanks. Lord Gove, you've said on the record the cautionary advice you received, particularly in regards to the Human Rights Act and L1 P1. And I just wondered whether, really, for both of you, given where you stand now and the hindsight that you can bring, what would you recommend to the current Secretary of State and Housing Minister in terms of how to stand up to some of perhaps that cautionary advice, and what we could change within this bill in order to get the best deal for as many people as quickly as we can?
Well, I had a maximum government, which is if the legal advice says no, get a better lawyer. And the truth is that the ECHR exists in order to, its stated aim is to protect the vulnerable, not to protect the wealthy. And so the right legal advice will strengthen the hand of a determined Secretary of State and a reforming Prime Minister to make that change. It should not be a barrier. There may be a broader argument about the ECHR and Britain's position within it. Never mind all that. You make that argument and use the weight of Parliament behind you, because you can always say Parliament has legislated for this, and therefore that weighs very heavily with the courts. In terms of other changes, as I mentioned briefly earlier, I think that the points that Harry Scoffin and others have made on tackling development value, the fact that freeholders can say, well, we could theoretically develop this property, it might then be worth more, so you need to pay us more, tackle that. Then the deferment and capitalisation rates, that's something that will be set as a result of this bill. So it's a sort of something in square brackets to be resolved, doesn't require extra work, just requires the right judgment. Again, the freehold lobby wants the deferment and capitalisation rates set low so that leaseholders pay more. That is unfair, tackle that. Then there is a restriction on people being able to fully enjoy commonhold rights because of the way in which sometimes some of their properties will be linked to commercial use. Make sure that everyone can exercise that right, and then ease the path towards right to manage. And in response to my Ellis earlier, I explained why I believe that that is in everyone's interests.
Just to say that I appreciate what Michael is saying, and the previous government said that they were going to do that, and actually we've gone much further, and there is challenges, to be fair, and if we had a magic wand, I'm sure we'd, but we're not Secretary of States in that challenge, and what we don't want to do is end up in high probability of litigation. Of course you can get yourself a lawyer that'll say just about anything you want, but there again, that doesn't mean to say you're going to win. So what you want to do is mitigate the risks of that, and therefore getting that right balance is prudent, rather than just thinking if I get myself a high-class lawyer and pay them a lot of money, they'll tell me what I want to hear. I think it's important that actually you're doing the work so that we can get to where we need to be for the people that need it, and we do that with as lower risk, balancing that risk in a fair way, because, you know, when we do have lawyers and when we do go to court, and if we do lose all, then that obviously is a cost. So therefore you have to weigh that up as well. You can't be gun-ho about that.
In the weighing up, though, just to push back slightly, what we're weighing up here is the opportunity for millions of people across the country to access the rights that we've outlined they deserve. And so, you know, what's the framework for Secretary of State to consider when to take on that fight and take the risk that occasionally you may lose it in order to progress things where we know the urgency for progress is so high?
I agree with you. I think Angela's argument makes perfect sense, and it is just a judgment call. But my judgment is that it is better to do the right thing and take the risk of JR, and indeed even take the risk of losing it to JR, to make that argument right. I know a number of occasions in government when we flinched from doing the right thing because of the risk of JR, and generally we regretted it. And then sometimes when we went ahead, when there was a risk of JR, and we were told we might well lose, but we won because the arguments that were put forward were the right arguments, and we had Parliament's backing. And that's the critical thing. I don't speak for the Conservative Party, but I think there is a groundswell of opinion in both houses in Parliament that would support the government taking the strongest possible measures to face down the freeholder lobby and to help leaseholders. And so therefore I think that should embolden the hands of the Prime Minister.
Thank you. Chris.
Thank you. Going to ask some questions on implementation, but thank you both of you for attending today. I think this has been an incredibly useful conversation for us to have. But we do have enough political podcasts already, so please don't the two of you go and start one. Just on implementation, Angela, do you think the government will be able to implement LAFRA and meaningful reform based on this draft bill within this Parliament?
Yes, if they stick to it, and they need to, because I think, you know, millions of people are affected by this, and it's what we said on the tin. As I said at the beginning, you know, we're changing 1,000 years of history here in terms of the current feudal system that we have, and we're ending it. And I think that we can start to do that with the measures that are within this bill, and that I think that we can be ambitious, and we can do it. And especially in light of what Lord Gove has said, if we could get the backing of the whole House and people, instead of what happened previously, people support the government in taking that forward, I think that we could make real progress.
Given the various constraints, the legal constraints, the legislative process constraints, you're not worried that we're going to run out of time?
Well, it's one of the reasons that, as I alluded to, and I think Lord Gove has said, in terms of the amount of legislation, that as Secretary of State I was really pushing hard with my colleagues that, to take up more than my fair share of the timetable that we have in Parliament, was because I felt that we needed the time, the lag time, for us to put this legislation in place so that it can have the desired effect before the end of the Parliament. So it is ambitious, but I do think that there is a lot that we could do to make sure it's implemented in time.
And Lord Gove, I think you sort of implied this before, but you seem to be saying that there was one of the restrictions is a limited budget or support capacity within the Office for Parliamentary Counsel. Now, my understanding is one of the reasons why there's potentially a limited budget is because of cuts that were made during the previous Conservative government. Yeah. Now, as somebody who was doing complicated bits of legislation towards the tail end of the last Conservative government, do you think those cuts in hindsight were a mistake?
Yes.
And do you think it is something that this Labour government should fix?
Definitely. Not just restore, but expand.
No, I just thank both of you for attending the committee. As I mentioned earlier, this is a very complex and timely piece of legislation. As a committee, we are very much looking forward to hearing from more people in the coming weeks, receiving more written evidence. And just to add that Grosvenor will be attending before the committee to give their side, and it's really important that we hear from them and other freeholders. Thank you very much for coming this morning. Order, order.